Welcome to the Embodied Healing Holistic Wellness Conversation series, sponsored by the Racial Healing and Wellness Coaching Program for Women. I am Nicole Newman, and I'm joined by my co-founder, Rosella Ide White. The purpose of this conversation series is to introduce ourselves, Racial Healing and Wellness Coaching for Women, and share key practices that ground this work. In this week's episode, we'll be exploring the key practice of embodiment. You may have heard us use this term frequently and be unsure of what it means. According to Prentice Hemphill, founder of the Embodiment Institute, embodiment is what is currently practiced or habituated in us. It is also the process of becoming more aware and practiced in behaviors. Racial healing and wellness coaching invites women to identify, name, and create habits that lead to embodiment of possibilities. Those possibilities are that you become bold and that women become bold in their beliefs around racial justice and equity, that they are empathetic in their relationships with other white people, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, that they're connected to their ancestral history and the realities that those histories have created, and that they're open-hearted to their own belovedness and the belovedness of others. We also hope that they become mindful of their biases and actions and words, that they engage in the ongoing work of deconstructing, dismantling, and decolonizing the lie of white body supremacy. And lastly, that they become spiritually grounded and in flow with the energetic forces, past, present, and future, that lead us to liberation. So those are our possibilities. And like every conversation, we're going to start with a short grounding that Rosella is going to lead us in.
Thanks, Nicole. Today, we're going to be sharing actually some more of Prentice's words from You Are Your Best Thing by Tarana Burke, edited by Tarana Burke and Brene Brown, on vulnerability, shame, resilience, and the Black experience. Prentice Hemphill has an essay in this work entitled The Wisdom of Process. And towards the end, this is what they write. Healing Black trauma is one of the most worthwhile endeavors we all can undertake. It is one that calls for the remaking of all social relations and an examination of our structures and the principles on which they are built. How has denying Black pain narrowed all of our lives? Where have we gone numb to our trauma, imagining that it is too big to face? We can imagine that the purpose of healing is to restore Black people to a mythic past or propel us into a whitewashed version of the future. I don't think healing follows directions. The truth is that I don't know what we become when we heal. No one does. That is the wisdom of the process. I know that when I opened myself up, I became more of me. I became curious and porous. I cried more and argued less. I knew where my fight belonged and where it didn't. I knew where I belonged, and I insisted on remaining. Ultimately, in healing, we become more of ourselves. As we were considering what our grounding was for today, and I remembered this book and this essay in particular, it was a perfect encapsulation of what we are doing with this work of racial healing and wellness coaching, right? It is the invitation to become more of ourselves. And today, for our fourth and final week in this conversation series, we're talking about the embodiment piece of it, right? Where we literally land in our bodies, in the ways that we show up. And I love Prentice's definition of embodiment about the habituated practices, those things that we do that come to life. And ultimately, embodiment is also a form of incarnation. For those who are from a faith-based, specifically Christian background, we understand the incarnation as the place and the site in which the divine becomes human, in which an idea becomes enfleshed, in which a way of being and spiritual energy takes on a tangible existence. And in this work, ultimately, right, we are wanting for ourselves, for the women that we work with, and for this work to be embodied. So we've talked about over the last 4 weeks that there are 4 practices that are integral to this work of racial healing and wellness coaching. The first week we looked at spirituality. The second week we looked at our values. Week 3, we talked about relationships. And tonight for our final week, we're looking at embodiment. And so when we talked about these practices, we said each of these practices make a possibility a reality. So we understand that embodiment ultimately leads to us being engaged in the ongoing work of deconstructing, dismantling, and decolonizing the lie of white body supremacy. And that's a lot. So I think tonight, or for today's conversation, we're going to unpack deconstructing, dismantling, and decolonizing, and also white body supremacy. So maybe we start there, Nicole, like why we're using that phrase. And so one of the core resources of our book is My Grandmother's Hands by Resmaa Menakem. Resmaa is how would we define Resmaa?
A practitioner, a author, a speaker,
a therapist. I think he's like a licensed therapist. But one of the things that when we came across his work and started just listening more to him that we really connected with was that he was one of the first people that pulled together some things for us in a very clear and concise way. So for the longest time, right, we think about almost like, I don't want to say first wave. I'm borrowing from like feminist thought, but
I love it. First wave racial justice.
Right? Was all about like, it was based on the premise that, well, if we're honest, we recognized that things had to be legalized, right? There were policies and laws and things that had to shift that moved us away from this encapsulated, enshrined racist history, ideology, practices that were literally baked into our law system structures, right? So there was something that had to happen on a political space for us to enter into, I think, deeper conversation around what does it mean for people who are embodying different racial, ethnic, cultural, gender, religious expressions to be protected and to be seen as human by the law, right? So there's that whole thing that was happening politically, legally. But when it came to education or the way that we engaged in anti-racism training, all of that, I think the first wave was, well, we're operating from a supposition that people just don't know, right? So it's a head thing, it's an intellectual thing. So how do we teach people, right? Train people, share information, share history so that people's minds expand. So I would say that's kind of like the first impetus was on thinking our thoughts, right? And then I think there was this emphasis that moved from the thoughts to like a feeling, and that feeling may be around proximity. So especially in faith-based spaces, you started seeing this like connection to, well, if I'm in relationship with someone who's different, then that will be the work as it relates to anti-racism, racial justice education. And here's the thing, both the thinking and the feeling and proximity, neither one of them are bad, but I don't think that they're complete. And I don't think that they actually get us to some of the deeper work that needs to happen in order for beliefs and behaviors to change. Because at the end of the day, let's be very clear, we as two Black-bodied women, right, are concerned with what Prentice talked about, even in the piece that I just read, around the healing and the ending of trauma against Black people. And so when we encountered Resmaa's work, Resmaa was doing something that was very different from head and from heart or from head and relationship. Resmaa was saying, actually, this is something that is a trauma that is deeply embodied in the bodies and the DNA of folks, all of folks. So he uses two distinctions. He talks about white-bodied supremacy, and he talks about bodies of culture. Right. And so when we were putting together this program, this became like an aha moment of, oh, we're not just doing head stuff and heart stuff. That is a part of it. But what we're ultimately looking for is the holistic coming together of these things that gets to our bodies. And this recognition that in our bodies, regardless of if you're white or a Black, Indigenous woman of color, there is the legacy of the trauma that white supremacy, that patriarchy, and that
Mm.
capitalism has embedded within us. And so we talk about white body supremacy following in Resma's work and his research around how that lives in our
Mm.
DNA. I don't know. Do you want to say anything else about that, Nicole, about the white body supremacy piece?
Yeah, the thing that I think is really powerful about Resma's work is that it doesn't discount the head and the heart, right?
Mm.
It is not like head and heart is bad, right? Inherently bad. What it invites us to is a deeper level of reflection, right? And so for me, when I think about time, I think about how things change over time. It becomes important that as we grow over time and our understanding shift over time, that our analysis shifts over time,
Mm.
right? And
Mhm.
so for me, it is like embodiment is the next wave of how we are talking about racial justice, because to not do so, right, then we're just talking about political space. We're just talking about proximity. We're just talking about relationships. We're just talking about headspace. And that is not enough, right? Again, we talked about last week sustainability. It's not enough to sustain the changes that we want, both at the inner,
Mhm.
at the self level and at the level of community and society. And so I think that nuance and that kind of building on what is, right? It's not just in service of your own embodiment, but it is in service of you having a
Mhm.
deeper awareness, and then ultimately doing something in the world that is radically different than maybe what you would have been invited to do previously. And I think that is a really powerful arc. It's a really powerful frame, and it for me gives me a lot of maybe not hope, but like gives me a lot of assurance, right, that things actually don't have to be this way, right, that we can
Yeah.
um that as people get more in contact with themselves, um that something else becomes possible in our relationships with one another.
Yeah, and even as you were saying that, right, what hits me is that we talk about these four practices that we really delve into and that our curriculum is designed around spirituality, values, relationships, and embodiment. And it's not lost on me that we're bookending two things that are central to who we are
Oh, for sure.
as women of profound faith in an expansive way, as women who are deeply spiritual, right? That we start with this spirituality, this
Mhm.
connection to source, to ancestry, to things larger than this life, because it reminds us of what ultimately is possible. But we also are moving towards, right, this incarnation, if you will, this way of being that shows up in our bodies, but that also attends to what trauma and harm the bodies have faced. I think the other thing that this makes me think about is when we were creating this program, we were very clear that nobody wins, right? There are no winners in a white body supremacy culture or white supremacist culture. White folks, brown folks, Black folks, all the folks are continued to be bound in oppression when we do not do this work at the cellular level. Because that's what this is, right? We're looking at the deeply embedded beliefs and behaviors that have been a part of our beings, our family beings, our communal way of being,
Mhm.
and really addressing that. And I don't think that we can address this, right? When we think about engaging this ongoing work in an embodied way, we can't address this without then talking about deconstructing,
Mhm.
dismantling, and decolonizing, right? So when we think about deconstructing, that's a word, especially in some faith spaces, that people are using a lot. And I know that some people can be annoyed by it because it's like, well, what does that mean? Right.
Mhm.
And so I think I'll just share, when we think about deconstructing, it's actually a process of literally taking what you've believed, what you have practiced, what you have heard, what you have valued, even your relationships, and creating, I think, space between yourself and those things so that you can start to become curious, right? For me, deconstructing only happens with deep curiosity and compassion. So I'm taking all of these things, I'm almost like placing them in front of myself or around myself, and I'm getting really curious about them, right?
Mhm.
I think that becomes the first part of deconstructing. What about you, Nicole?
Yeah, I think about deconstructing as like the I think that there's a way to look at deconstructing as like, that there's an element to it that sometimes people use as like a violent, fast process,
Mm,
right? And I think for me, what really settles for me is that deconstruction is always, it's like construction is about building, right? And so how do you build? You build over time. Deconstruction is about like doing that over time. And I think one of the things that has been really present for my own life in terms of my own embodiment and my own embodied practices is paying attention to pace.
mm,
And so I think the invitation, right, to deconstruction is an invitation to consider what is the pace at which you are unlearning and like rebuilding the foundation
mm.
on which you stand as a human being, right? And
And
that,
that's, oh yeah. No, no,
yeah,
go ahead.
it just it just requires a level of self-compassion and patience. And I also think, um I think the critique that people always say is like, but the conditions that folks are in are urgent. And I'm like, yeah, but even those conditions that we find ourselves, when you look at them and you start to deconstruct those conditions, those were built over time too,
Yes, yes,
right? And so like we don't actually serve ourselves by trying to match pace.
no. And this perfectly speaks to why our program, right? Our programs happen basically over the course of a year.
Mhm.
There is not work that we do when it comes to our coaching cohorts, regardless of the who that we're coaching, the different affinities of women that we're coaching, that happens like overnight. This is not like a week's program or a couple of months program.
And
These are
intensive.
these are not intensives, right? And ultimately what we're building towards is, as people experience the cohort that they are signed up for, there is a community that's waiting to welcome them on the other side, because we recognize that this is lifelong work, right? This is not something that just happens overnight. But we also don't want to get stuck in navel gazing either, because that's easy to do too. I just keep looking. Now we're moving towards action for sure. And we recognize that there's something to be said about pace, about time, and the curiosity and compassion that are required to continue to deconstruct. And I feel like the deconstruct then leads into, or is also connected to, the dismantling. So if the deconstruction for me is around the things that we have been taught to believe, I feel like dismantling becomes the things that we do. Like we're starting to take apart our habits and our practices. Um, and that also for us requires a community of care and support, because the first step is to recognize and become aware. Then we become curious about it. Then we start to notice when it's happening in real time in order to dismantle the habit and practice that we've been operating under, and then practice a new habit, form a new habit in real time. So for me, that's the distinction between the deconstruct and the dismantle, because they can be conflated, but I think that there's some nuance between our beliefs and our behaviors, or what we value and what we practice in our relationships. So when you think about dismantling, what comes up for you?
I just think it's the ongoing work of interrogation, right? Like
Mm,
I think of dismantling as like on every level, right? You talked about a cellular level, but on every level, and on my in my mental, my physical body, and my um and my behaviors and practices. How am I really like aware of and clear about like what I'm doing, what my
mm,
defaults are, how I'm
mhm.
moving, right? And the only way to do that is to stop long enough to interrogate and ask those questions,
Yeah.
right? Which you've already, like you've already said, it's like the questions give way to the spaciousness that allows something else to be possible. But I just think that for me, that there's something there about really being like, can I can I stop?
Can I stop?
Can I slow down long enough to see myself in real time? Do I like the reflection? Is it in alignment with who I say I am and who I want to be?
Yeah.
And I think that there's something really countercultural in our society about being like, I actually am I'm divesting from like continuous action and like this way of operating that just is like the only way to be committed to justice is to be in these outward displays of of solidarity or of martyrdom, frankly. Like the only way to do this work is to sacrifice myself.
And that's not what we're not doing. We're not doing that.
Right. And I think that part of dismantling is to ask those questions. Is the way that I'm moving towards justice serving me, serving, right? Serving folks who I say I care about? Is it moving me closer to where I say I want to be? Right? Like it's all of those questions that you have to sit with yourself and answer, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes it's hard.
It actually connects directly to the next piece of this. We talk about deconstructing, dismantling, and ultimately decolonizing. And I think that sitting with that uncomfortable liminal space allows for a different reality to bubble up, one that is not centering white history, white narratives, whiteness, right? And we're not saying anything about white people. We're talking about the construct of whiteness that has led to the creation of systems that prioritize people based on their racial identity, that oppresses some and provides privilege to others. And so the decolonizing piece of this is to actually look at all areas of our lives, right? We talk about the land that we're living in or living on, going back to what we talked about earlier when we were sharing a little bit about our identities of having indigenous ancestry and history within the two of us, right? Land is a big deal because land was something along with people that was stolen, that was taken over, that was decimated in order to make a profit. So what is our relationship to land and to place and space? What is our relationship with ourselves? What is our relationship with others, right? And how are we being honest about the ways that the culture that we are a part of, especially when we think about our main context being those of us in the United States, how has that been fraught with colonial mindset and ways of thinking? So this going in, taking over, using for one's own purpose, and profiting off of the pain, the trauma, the bodies of people that were not within the white construct.
Well, and I also think that it's not just the like glorification and the like what whiteness, right? Like the over identification with whiteness. It's also the trivializing of cultural practices, right? So we know that we don't want to be that. We don't want to be, right? We know that we don't buy into whiteness, but then we trivialize and reduce our own cultural practices to things that, may or may not be relevant in a given space, right? I don't know if I'm being clear about that, but I just think that sometimes the pendulum swing on that is that we're disavowing whiteness, and so we're like, okay, so I mean, I'm not saying anything, this is not to be shady, but it's like, all right, so fuck whiteness, but then also like we don't have rigor when it comes to, right? Because time is a construct, so we don't have rigor when it comes to time.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
So Black cultural practices are reduced to saying ashe and eating soul food.
So it goes from like, and it's almost like, what are we crafting versus what are we against? Right. And how are we going much more deeply? And I think this is into ourselves, our histories, and our relationships with others and our practices. Because I think what ends up happening is, well, if this is the one way that is steeped in whiteness that we've all been taught, like it's almost the binary thinking. There is no other way that we can have a profound critical construction of that can provide an alternative or alternatives, right? Because it's not just one. Again, we're in the business of possibilities of liberation. And those possibilities come forth when we are clear about what we're deconstructing, about what we're dismantling, when we're clear about the way that colonialism has shown up. So we're now considering decolonized ways of being, believing, and behaving. And now we're invited into a space of creativity. Who was it that used to say, because I think you introduced me to the quote, that white supremacy ultimately is about a lack of imagination?
There's somebody wiser than me.
Yeah, like, but this notion that when we get to this engaging, the ongoing work of deconstructing, dismantling, and decolonizing the lie of white body supremacy and the lie of white supremacy, we're actually pushing back against the lack of imagination about what human flourishing, abundance, connection, healing, and wellness could actually look like.
Right.
And that's ultimately
and we don't
what
have to rush. And that's I think the point I'm trying to make is that we don't have to rush to get to those things. That we can take the winding path to figuring it out.
Yeah.
Right. That the rush to figure out, okay, in the absence of white supremacy, what are we creating, actually creates more white supremacy.
Yes. And that's why we always also refer to, I think, the Tema Akun characteristics of white supremacy culture resource, because in that we see what it looks like in action, right? We see the way that white supremacy shows up. And one of those ways is in the urgency. It's in the, we've got to figure it out now. We've got to do it now. We've got to, and that's something that we're pushing against as well in our embodiment.
And I would say, I always tell people, my own experience is that the more in contact I am with my own body, the better my decision-making is. Right?
In every way.
Every way. So like,
every way.
And there are people out there who would have me believe that I actually don't have the time or the space or the leisure or the luxury because of the identities I hold, because of the commitments that I have, because of the positions and organizations I hold, that I don't have the time to sit with myself or sit with my own body. And I'm like, but my decision making is clear.
Right.
How I show up as a leader, what I'm committed to, the solutions I'm able to generate, the strategies I'm able to come up with are so much more grounded and feel better the more in contact with my own body I become. Right. But it's unpopular. Who wants to, right? That don't get you on the news. That don't get you.
I always go back to your question that you as a young organizer had me always coming back to. Who benefits? Who is benefiting from us being disembodied? Who or what is benefiting from our need for urgency versus slowing down? And we know that the beneficiary ultimately is the ongoing perpetuation of a cycle and a system that is that does not want our flourishing, that does not want our healing and our wellness and our wholeness and our restoration, that does not want this vision of this beloved community. And that's ultimately what we're pushing back against. All right.
All right. Well, we got to ask ourselves some questions. Well, thank you for joining us for this conversation series over the last 4 weeks. These videos will remain accessible on Facebook and YouTube, and we ask that you share the series with people in your networks or people who you think would be curious or benefit from them. It is not too late to sign up to receive our free resource, Bridging the Gap from Black History to Women's History Month. This resource will invite you to reflect on practices that help you embody the possibilities of racial healing and wellness. Make sure that you're also following us on social media. We are at Racial Heal Well on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube for now.